I had a stroke in my own kitchen on a Wednesday morning in November, and my son didn't know about it for 4 days. Not because no one tried to reach him. They tried. My neighbor Margaret called his cell phone 11 times. The paramedics tried twice from the ambulance. The nurses at Sunnybrook tried every number on file. 31 calls in total over 4 days. He didn't pick up once. When I finally opened my eyes in the ICU, the face I saw wasn't my son's. It was my former student, Priya. Red-eyed and exhausted, holding my hand like her life depended on it. And on the tray beside my bed, propped against a water pitcher, was a photo someone had printed from my son's Instagram. My son and his wife on a ski hill in Whistler, both grinning in matching jackets. The caption, reading, "Finally unplugged. No calls. No drama. Just the mountains and us." That photo was posted 36 hours after I lost consciousness on my kitchen floor. That was the moment I understood this wasn't an accident. This was a choice. And before this story is over, that choice was going to cost him everything. My name is Dorothy, and I'm 68 years old. I've lived in Oakville, Ontario, my entire adult life. My late husband, Gerald, and I raised our son, Marcus, in the same house where I still live, a 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street lined with old maples. Gerald passed 3 years ago from pancreatic cancer. The disease moved fast, the way it always does. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Marcus flew in from Vancouver for the last 5 days. He stayed for the funeral, helped me sort through a few boxes, and left on a Sunday morning saying he needed to get back to work. I told him I understood. I told myself the same thing. That November morning, I had been making tea. I remember the kettle had just clicked off. I remember reaching for my favorite mug. The green one Gerald bought me at a farmer's market in Prince Edward County. And then nothing. The next thing I knew, it was the ceiling of an ambulance. A young paramedic pressing an oxygen mask to my face. And the sound of Margaret's voice somewhere behind me saying, "She's my neighbor." I found her on the floor. "Please." She was cold. Margaret Chen is 72 years old. She has lived next door for 26 years. We share a fence, a compost agreement, and a habit of leaving soup on each other's doorsteps when the weather turns. She had come over to return a casserole dish and found my front door unlocked, which I never leave unlocked. Something told her to walk in. I owe her my life. And I told her so the moment I was well enough to say the words. The stroke was significant. Left side weakness. Some speech disruption. The kind of event that leaves a mark. The doctors were cautious but measured, with rehabilitation and time. They said there was a real path to recovery. But the first 72 hours were critical. I needed someone. The hospital needed a next of kin. Margaret called my son. Then she called again. And again. Priya Nair was 34 years old and worked as a social worker at a community center in Mississauga. She had been in my grade 11 English class in Brampton back when I was still teaching. I had retired 8 years ago. But Priya and I had stayed in touch. She called me every few weeks. She had driven me to a cardiology follow-up last spring when my knee was giving me trouble. She found out about the stroke through Margaret, who had my phone and scrolled through it looking for anyone, who might come. Priya arrived at the hospital within 2 hours of that call. She stayed for 4 days. She slept in the chair beside my bed. She spoke to the nurses, asked the questions I couldn't ask myself, made notes in a little orange notebook she kept in her purse. When I woke up and saw her face, she pressed my hand and said, "You're okay. I'm here. Don't try to talk yet. My son arrived on day 5. He came directly from Pearson Airport, still in his ski jacket, a rolling suitcase behind him. His wife, Tanya, had stayed in Vancouver. He walked into my room and the first thing he said was, "Mom, I'm so sorry. There was no service at the resort. I had no idea." He hugged me briefly. He looked uncomfortable. His eyes moved around the room like he was cataloging it. Priya was in the corner. She had stepped back to give us space. But she was watching. I introduced them. Marcus barely acknowledged her. He sat on the edge of the visitor's chair, scrolling through his phone while the neurologist explained my condition, occasionally nodding. When the doctor left, Marcus turned to me and said, "Okay. So the question is, what's the plan going forward? Because obviously you can't be alone here." I said, "I have been alone for 3 years." "Marcus," he said, "right. But this changes things. We should probably start thinking about options." I asked him what kind of options he meant. He said we'd talk about it later. He glanced at his phone again. He stayed for 3 days. He brought me a tin of shortbread from the airport gift shop. He ate the cafeteria food and complained about it. He asked me twice about Gerald's life insurance policy and once about whether I had updated my will since Dad passed. Each time I said we'd talk about it later. Each time he agreed and then brought it up again the next day. On his last evening, he sat beside me and said, quietly, carefully, the way he uses his voice when he is preparing a presentation, "Mom, I've been doing some reading, and there are some really excellent continuing care communities in the GTA. Some of them are really nice, not like the old-fashioned ones. Gerald's policy would cover the transition costs pretty comfortably." I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, "I'd like to rest now." He left the next morning. He hugged me at the door. He said he'd call. He did call twice in the following 2 weeks. Both times the same conversation, probing gently about my living situation, mentioning specific facilities by name, asking if I had spoken to my GP about long-term planning. Each time I said I was managing, each time he said, "Just something to think about." "Mom, I was thinking about it. I just wasn't thinking about it in the way he imagined." Margaret visited me every day I was in hospital. She brought real food. A thermos of congee the first day. Sesame noodles the second. A container of her daughter's chicken soup the third. She sat with me and talked about nothing important and everything that mattered. She told me about the neighbors, about the new family on the corner, about the maple tree in my backyard dropping its last leaves. She made the room feel less like a medical facility and more like a living room. On the 4th day, she brought my green mug from home, washed and wrapped in a tea towel. "I thought you'd want it," she said. I held it for a long time without drinking anything. I was in hospital for 18 days total. Rehabilitation began almost immediately. Small things at first. Squeezing a ball. Standing with assistance. Relearning the coordination in my left hand. A physiotherapist named Danielle came every morning. She was patient and specific and never talked down to me. By day 12, I was walking the length of the corridor twice a day. By day 16, I was making my own tea. Priya came every other day. She brought my mail, forwarded anything that looked important, watered the plant I had forgotten on my kitchen windowsill. She drove me home on discharge day. She helped me up the front steps carefully and stood in my kitchen while I looked around at a house that felt both entirely familiar and entirely new. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked. I told her yes. I told her I needed to make a phone call. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and thought through everything methodically. My son had arrived 5 days late. He had asked about money 3 times in 3 days. He had mentioned a care facility twice unprompted. He had left without offering to arrange anything concrete. No meal delivery. No home care assessment. No scheduled visit. He had called twice in 2 weeks. Both calls were about logistics. Not about me. It was the specificity of the facility names that sat wrong with me. You don't mention a continuing care community by name unless you've already looked it up. You don't know that a life insurance policy will cover transition costs comfortably unless you've already done the math. He had been preparing this conversation before he landed at Pearson. He may have been preparing it before he even got on the plane. I called my old colleague Patricia, who had retired from teaching 2 years before me and now lived in Burlington. I told her what I was thinking. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dorothy, has Marcus called anyone else, like mutual friends, your church, anyone who knows you?" I said I didn't know. I asked why she was asking. She said, "Because he called me last month." I sat very still. Patricia told me the call had come in late October. About 3 weeks before my stroke, Marcus had been friendly and warm. Chatted about the weather, about how she was settling into retirement. Then he had asked about me. Specifically, he had asked whether I seemed different to her lately, whether I seemed to be forgetting things, whether I had seemed confused or disoriented the last time she had seen me. Patricia said she had laughed it off at the time. Told him I was sharper than either of them. No offense. But Marcus had pressed. He said he was worried about me living alone, that he wanted to be proactive about my care, that he didn't want me to know he was asking because he didn't want to worry me. Patricia said she had thought it was an odd call but had let it go. She was telling me now because I was asking. I thanked her and sat in my kitchen for a long time after we hung up. The following morning, I called our family friend Henrik, who had been Gerald's fishing partner for 20 years and who still shoveled my driveway every winter without being asked. He answered on the second ring. When I asked him whether Marcus had been in touch recently, there was a pause just long enough to tell me everything. "Yes," he said. "About 6 weeks ago. Semkis Jones. Was I managing the house? Had I seemed forgetful, confused about dates? Any incidents?" Henrik had told him I was completely fine. That I ran a tighter household than anyone he knew. That Marcus should call me more often instead of calling other people to ask about me. Marcus had thanked him and ended the call. 2 people. 2 calls. Weeks before the stroke. And then, when the stroke actually happened, 31 missed calls. He wasn't gathering evidence because he was worried. He was gathering evidence because he was planning. He needed people who knew me to say, "Yes, she's declining. Yes, she can't manage alone. Yes, this is a concern." He needed testimony. And he was going to use a stroke that he had let happen without coming to the hospital to strengthen the case. A mother who had a stroke alone, who had already been described as forgetful and confused by people around her, a care facility would have looked inevitable, responsible even. And once I was in a facility, the house would be available to sell. Gerald and I had paid off this house 20 years ago. In the current Oakville market, it was worth just under $1.5 million. That was the number I couldn't stop seeing. I called our family solicitor, a woman named Frances Okafor, who had handled Gerald's estate and who I had known for 15 years. I told her everything, calmly and in order. The stroke. The 31 missed calls. Marcus's arrival 5 days later. The questions about the will and the insurance. The facility names. And then Patricia and Henrik and the calls that had come weeks before any of this. Frances listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Dorothy, I've seen this before. It has a pattern. The pattern has a name. What I need you to do right now is not discuss any estate matters with Marcus until we've spoken in detail. Can you do that?" I said yes. We met in person 2 days later. Priya drove me. Frances had pulled Gerald's will and my existing documents and had spent the intervening days reviewing the structure. We sat in her office on a gray December afternoon, and I told her what I wanted to do. She took notes. She asked questions. At the end, she looked at me steadily and said, "Are you certain? Because once this is done, it is done." I told her I had been certain since the moment I sat in my kitchen and did the math. The changes were as follows. My granddaughter, Lily, Marcus's daughter from his first marriage, who was 12 years old and who I had been quietly sending birthday and Christmas money to for 4 years because Marcus and his first wife had separated badly and contact had been inconsistent, would receive a protected education trust of $120,000, administered by Frances directly, with no parental access of any kind until Lily turned 19. Priya would receive $40,000, designated plainly in the will as recognition for demonstrated loyalty and care. A significant portion of the estate would go to 2 organizations I had been involved with for years, the Oakville Library System's literacy program, which Gerald had volunteered with every Saturday for a decade, and a stroke recovery fund at the hospital, where Danielle, the physiotherapist, worked and where I had spent 18 days being put back together. Marcus would receive $1. The house, upon my death, would pass to the Literacy Trust. It could not be sold before then without my signature on every document, and Frances had been designated my legal representative for any transactions I was unable to execute personally. Frances had also arranged something else. Cognizant of what Marcus had said at the hospital about my mental state, she had organized a formal capacity assessment with a clinical neuropsychologist. I completed it 1 week before the meeting. I passed with the kind of scores that would make the results impossible to contest in any Ontario court. I called Marcus and told him I wanted to go over some estate planning, just to make sure things were up to date after the stroke. He was on the phone in under a second. He said absolutely. Of course. He'd been hoping I'd want to talk about this. He could fly in any time. I told him the following Thursday. 2 o'clock. France's office. He said perfect. He asked if Tanya should come. I said that was up to him. He said he'd bring her. They arrived early. Marcus in a dark blazer. Tanya in a camel coat. Both looking like they had come from a business lunch. They stopped when they saw Priya sitting beside me. Tanya looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Priya and then at me and said, "Mom, is this really appropriate? This is a family meeting." I said, "Priya is family. Please sit down." Frances opened with the legal formalities, briefly and professionally. Then she turned to me. And I spoke. I told Marcus I knew he had called Patricia in October. I told him I knew he had called Henrik in October. I told him I knew the questions he had asked. I saw the color change in his face. Tanya looked at her hands. I told him I knew he had arrived 5 days after 31 phone calls. I told him I had kept a record. I told him I knew the names of the facilities he had researched, because he had mentioned them by name, and I had looked them up, and they were real, and they were in the GTA. And the pricing was exactly consistent with what Gerald's life insurance policy would cover. I told him I wasn't angry. I said that was true. And it was. I wasn't angry. I was clear. He tried to interrupt twice. The first time I held up my hand. The second time, France did. I told him that I understood, in some way, how a person could reach the place he had reached. That grief does strange things. That watching a parent age alone can produce fear that expresses itself as control. That there might be a version of this story where his motivations were more complicated than simple greed. I told him I had sat with that possibility for weeks. And then I told him that regardless of his motivations, he had called 2 people who loved me and asked them to describe me as incompetent. He had let 31 phone calls go unanswered while I was in the ICU. He had arrived 5 days late, asked about money 3 times, and suggested a care facility twice in 3 days without once asking how I was sleeping, whether I was afraid, whether I needed anything. He had behaved like a man with a plan, not like a son. Tanya started to cry quietly. I did not find this moving, Marcus said, his voice different now, lower and less controlled. Mom, you're throwing away everything over one mistake. We couldn't get service at the resort. I've explained that. I told him about the Instagram post, the timestamp, Vistla, finally unplugged. No calls. No drama. Just the mountains and us. There was a silence I had not heard since the night Gerald died. Marcus said, "That was Tanya's post." Tanya said, very quietly. "Marcus," I said. "It was posted from your joint account." Frances placed a printed copy of the post on the table. Timestamp visible. She placed beside it the hospital call log. 31 attempts. 3 days. Marcus said nothing. Frances began reading the revised will. When she reached Lily's trust, Marcus went still. $120,000. No parental access. He looked at the table. When she reached Priya's bequest, Tanya made a sound. Priya. Beside me. Whispered. Dorothy. You don't have to. I squeezed her hand and didn't let go. When Frances reached the charitable bequests, the literacy program, the stroke fund, Marcus looked up for the first time in several minutes. He said, "How much is left?" Frances turned the page. $1. The silence was very complete. Marcus pushed back from the table. He said it was punitive. He said I was making a decision while emotionally compromised. He said I would regret this. He said Gerald would be ashamed of me. I waited until he finished. Then I said, "Your father died asking where you were for the last 3 days of his life. I told him you were coming. You weren't. I sat in that room alone and I lied to him because I loved him and I didn't want his last hours to be sad." I paused. "I've been lying for you for a long time." Marcus. I've stopped now. Frances noted for the record that a certified capacity assessment had been completed the previous week and would be filed with the estate documentation. She said any legal challenge would face that assessment. The hospital call log, the social media record, and testimony from 2 independent witnesses who had received calls questioning my competence before any medical event occurred. She said she recommended against a challenge. She said it warmly. In the way that means this conversation is over, Marcus and Tanya left. He did not say goodbye at the door. Tanya paused, turned back, looked at me for a moment, and then left without saying anything. The door closed. The room was quiet. Priya had tears on her face. Frances was gathering papers with the composed efficiency of someone who had done this before and would do it again. I sat in my chair and felt something I had been searching for since Gerald died. Not victory. Not relief exactly. Something simpler. I felt like myself. The weeks that followed were not easy. Marcus called several times. Different registers each call. Angry. Then, conciliatory. then quietly desperate. Tanya sent me an email that was 3 paragraphs of explanation and 1 paragraph of what sounded like genuine regret. I read it twice and then did not respond. Margaret came over the day after the will meeting, and I told her the whole story while we drank tea at my kitchen table. And she listened to all of it and then said, "Good." Just that one word. Good. The stroke recovery continued. Danielle came to the house twice a week through January. My left hand was almost fully operational by February. I was driving again by March. Short distances. The grocery store. The library. The community center where Priya worked and where I had started volunteering on Tuesday afternoons. Sitting with elderly residents who had no family visitors and reading to them. Talking to them. Bringing them the small dignities that cost nothing and mean everything. Lily came to visit in April. She was 12 and serious, and had her grandfather's eyes, the exact warm brown of the man I had spent 40 years beside. Her mother, Marcus's first wife, had reached out after the will meeting. A brief, careful message saying she had always thought I was a good person and she hoped I was recovering well. Lily came with her, and we spent an afternoon baking butter tarts. The real ones, with the slightly runny centers, the way Gerald always made them. And Lily told me about her school and her friends and the book she was reading. And when they left, she stood at my door and said, "Can I come back?" And I said, "As often as you like. I keep her drawing on my fridge." She made it during that visit. Pencil crayons on a piece of paper she found in my junk drawer. A picture of the 2 of us at the kitchen table with what I believe is meant to be a plate of butter tarts between us. For Grandma Dorothy, it says in her careful 12-year-old printing, "It is the best thing on my refrigerator. It is possibly the best thing in the house." It is June now. 7 months since the stroke. My recovery has gone better than the doctors initially projected. I walk every morning along the lakeshore path. 30 minutes. Sometimes 40, if the light is good. I have started a book club with Margaret and 3 women from the library literacy program. I am planning a trip to Victoria in September. My first time to British Columbia in 15 years. I booked it myself. A direct flight from Pearson. A small hotel, 2 blocks from the inner harbor. I am going alone. I am not afraid. Marcus has not called in 6 weeks. I do not know what he will do eventually. I do not know if something in him will change. If he will become someone capable of recognizing what he chose and what it cost. I have stopped trying to predict it. I have stopped doing the thing I did for 3 years after Gerald died. Making myself smaller and quieter and more convenient so that my son would not find me burdensome. It did not work. It never works. And I am 68 years old with a repaired heart and a full life, and I do not have years to spend becoming invisible. People sometimes ask what family means. After something like this, I used to give the polite answer: blood, history, shared memory. But I have sat in too many hospital rooms now. My husband's and my own. To believe that biology is the whole story. Family is the person who calls Margaret when they find her neighbor cold on the kitchen floor. Family is the woman who sleeps 4 nights in a vinyl hospital chair and keeps notes in an orange notebook. Family is the neighbor who brings your green mug from home, washed and wrapped in a tea towel, because she thought you'd want it. Family is a 12-year-old girl drawing butter tarts on a piece of paper from a junk drawer. I have a plane ticket on my desk. I have a green mug on my kitchen counter. I have a drawing on my fridge and a friend coming for tea on Thursday and a walk to take tomorrow morning if the weather holds. I have 31 missed calls on a hospital log in a file folder in Francis's office. And I have never been more certain of anything in my life. If this story has stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. If you have ever had to draw a line with someone you loved, or if you have been the person who showed up when no one expected you to, Your words matter here. And if you believe it is never too late to choose yourself, type that in the comments. Because I need to know you are out there. Before you go, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Rare Revenge for more stories about real people, hard choices, and the families we build when the ones we were given let us down. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know.